getting in their places. As I was thinking about how to put this panel into context for you, I thought about a story that really starts back in 2008. And if you'll remember, 2008, that was the year that we heard the famous phrase, drill, baby, drill, really take hold. That was the presidential election, and drill, baby, drill became the rallying cry of the Republican ticket. And I don't really think any of us were ready for having our issue elevated to that level of presidential election politics as it was. And I don't think we really had the organization to fight it. And there's a good reason why we didn't have that organization. We didn't have it because there were literally 2 standing moratoria against the expansion of drilling to the Pacific and the Atlantic. There was a presidential moratorium and there was a congressional moratorium. The presidential moratorium, George W. Bush withdrew the presidential moratorium in 2008 in an effort to open up the Pacific and the Atlantic to offshore drilling. And that was a moratorium that was put in place by his own father back in 1990. It stood for 18 years until he withdrew it. And not only did he do that, but he also called on Congress to withdraw their moratorium. So that was a congressional moratorium that was reinstated every single year, year after year after year, for 25 years. Through Republican Congresses and Democratic Congresses, it was reliable and it was preventing expansion of drilling into the Pacific and the Atlantic. And when Congress withdrew that moratorium, it was open season on drilling in both oceans. And we weren't ready to fight that. And his plan was to open up the Pacific and the Atlantic. And we were very concerned about this, and luckily he wasn't president much longer, and President Obama came in, and we thought, well, we have a chance here. And what did President Obama do? But he put out his first draft plan, and in his plan, he also envisioned drilling in the Atlantic. Not in the North Atlantic. He said, no, we won't drill above the New Jersey-Delaware boundary, but we want to drill in mid and South Atlantic, and we're not going to drill in the Pacific. So it was a little better, but it was still a really huge concern. And I remember talking to David Hayes, who at the time was the Deputy Secretary for the Interior, the agency responsible for leasing areas for offshore drilling, and asking David, why did you take out the Pacific and the North Atlantic, but not the Mid and the South Atlantic? And David said, because the people there don't want it. The people there don't want offshore drilling. Well, I have news for you. I live in the Mid-Atlantic, and the people there don't want offshore drilling either. And the people in the South Atlantic, they don't want offshore drilling either. But they hadn't made their voices heard. So good for you guys on the West Coast and the North Atlantic, but we still had some work to do here. We needed to organize. And so we set out to do that. We put a small field team in place. It's still in place today. Our field organizers are here today. But before we could really get very far in the organizing, in 2010, of course, the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster happened. And we all knew, not just those of us in this room, we all as a country knew, and even beyond the United States we knew, that offshore drilling, at that moment we knew, it was dirty and it was dangerous, and that we needed a better way. And we all knew it. There was no question. Nobody would argue that. And that moment in time lasted for a few months, and then it was back to business as usual, and we were back to drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, and we were back to talking about drilling in the Atlantic. Well, I'm happy to report that that 5-year drilling plan that President Obama finalized for 2012 to 2017 did not include the Atlantic. He saw the light, he withdrew the Atlantic, and we basically got a 5-year moratorium in place at that time. In 2012, we knew we had 5 years, but we also knew that we would be back here fighting this again 5 years later. And that's what we're doing today. And we've been fighting it ever since. We've been building. We didn't make that mistake again. We didn't get complacent. And we've been building opposition along the coast. And we started with trying to stop the use of seismic air guns. Seismic air guns are a technology that's used to look for oil. It's the first step to drilling for offshore oil, and it's a prerequisite for drilling to offshore oil. So we worked to stop seismic air guns. And we worked, and a little over a year ago, we had a breakthrough when a little town in North Carolina rose up against its leadership because its leadership came out in support of the use of seismic air guns, and the town thought that was a bad idea. And soon after that, another town in North Carolina stepped up and passed a resolution opposing seismic air guns. And now today we have 60 cities and towns along the southeast that have stood up and said no and passed formal resolutions against seismic air guns, thanks to the work of a lot of the people in this room, Oceana organizers, other organizations on the coast that have been doing this. 60 towns, recently Columbia, South Carolina. the capital of South Carolina, opposing seismic testing, some of them seismic testing and offshore drilling. And this is what we need. But a year from now, we need that to be 600 towns. And so all of us in this room can look at the towns we live in, the cities we live in. They don't have to be coastal. Columbia, South Carolina is not coastal last time I checked. And we can say, we can pass a resolution in our town too. And if you want